Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 102 called The First Crusaders. In the last episode we heard how the Persian Shah Khosroes refused even to reply to the Roman Senate's desperate offer of peace in 615. The Senate made the offer instead of the Emperor Heraclius because Khosroes wouldn't recognise him as emperor, preferring his fake candidate for the throne, supposedly Maurice's eldest and only surviving son Theodosius. In the event, it really didn't matter who made the offer, since Khosroes had decided to obliterate the Roman Empire from the face of the planet. In 615, Khosroes prepared his invasion of Egypt, the richest of all of Rome's provinces. There were no more diversionary attacks on Constantinople, and the only advance made by Shan, the Persian general in command of the northern armies, was to capture the strategically important fortress town of Melitene in either 617 or 618. Meanwhile, Khosroes was busy building up his army in Palestine, ready to advance into Egypt. But securing full control of Palestine was more difficult than might be imagined, since the withdrawal of the Roman army to Egypt had encouraged the Arab Bedouin tribes to raid Palestine and Jordan. Shahrbaraz, the Persian general in command of the southern armies, had to repel these raids, and to do this he enlisted the support of the Christian Ghassanid Arabs, Rome's traditional allies against Persia in this region. This seems to have been successful, and he also mollified Christian sentiment in Jerusalem and elsewhere by reinstating the Roman ban on Jewish immigration into the city. The Persians took advantage of the Monophysite dislike of Chalcedonian Constantinople to strengthen their relationship with the local population in a way that the Arabs would do some 20 years later. This religious division within the Roman Empire between Chalcedonians and Monophysites was, I think, a central weakness for the Romans, and one of the main reasons why the largely Monophysite populations of Egypt and the Levant yielded to first the Persians and later the Arabs, a subject we'll return to in later episodes. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, Heraclius was expecting the loss of Egypt. He stockpiled grain from Egypt and also suspended the free distribution of bread. In previous years, this would have caused uproar and rebellion, but not now. Everyone knew the empire's fate hung by a thread. Indeed, Heraclius said he might leave the capital and go to Carthage to continue the fight from there. This was probably more of a threat than a serious intention. By talking of abandoning the capital to its fate, he made it easier to impose tough new conditions on its inhabitants. Finally, in 619, the long-awaited Persian offensive into Egypt began. Many wealthier Romans had already fled, mostly to Carthage rather than Constantinople, carrying with them as much wealth as they could manage. Indeed, they took so much gold out of the province that one source says the price of gold rocketed by 50%. However, most of the Monophysite clergy remained in situ, perhaps less frightened at the prospect of the Persians than their Chalcedonian colleagues would have been. We have almost no details about the Persian invasion. What little we have says the Persian generals Shahrbaraz and Shan united their forces for the attack. The only part of the conflict recorded in our sources was the siege of Alexandria. This may be because the fighting was genuinely confined to this city, which was, of course, the capital of the province and by far the best place to resist the Persian advance. Our records say that Shahrbaraz was made commander-in-chief of the operation. He advanced up to the city, but couldn't storm its powerful walls. Meanwhile, his deputy Shan, previously commander of the northern armies, focused on capturing the territory around Alexandria in the Nile Delta. But, initially at least, the Roman army showed no sign of surrendering. This was probably because of the lack of Persian naval power. Indeed, throughout the whole of the last war of antiquity, the Romans always had command of the eastern Mediterranean Sea, and this meant in the case of Alexandria they could easily supply it indefinitely from the sea. So, faced with the impregnable Roman defences and unable to starve the city into submission, Sharbaraz sat down and wondered what to do. Then one day he had a stroke of luck. From out of nowhere he was approached by an Arab, a man from Qatar, who knew the city well from his days as a philosophy student there. He had an ingenious way of getting into the city. He told the Persian general that fishermen from the city would go out at night to catch fish departing from the city's west gate, and that the Persians should disguise themselves as fishermen and get into the city by trickery. Sharbaraz prepared a commando force of his best troops, disguised as fishermen and aboard fishing vessels, to mingle with the genuine fishermen and approach the west gate by night. The ruse worked. The guards manning the west gate didn't realise the Persian trick until it was too late, and the Persians had docked and came ashore. They killed the guards, took control of the west gate, and proclaimed victory from the city walls. This sparked panic in the city. The garrison commander, Isaac, fled. Many of the city's wealthier inhabitants had already prepared for their escape in the event of a Persian breakthrough and now sailed away in boats laden with provisions and possessions. Unfortunately for them, the wind was blowing in the wrong direction and washed most of them up along the eastern shore of the city, where Persian forces picked them up. Although one source claims the Persians slaughtered the city's inhabitants, all the others deny this and say the Persian occupation was a relatively peaceful affair. Sharbaraz rounded up the able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 50 and held them securely in case there was resistance. But there wasn't any. We have no information about what happened to the Roman army in Egypt or its commander, Heraclius' cousin Nicetas, who you recall had played a prominent role in the rebellion against Phocas. At this point, they both disappeared from the pages of history. In fact, we know almost nothing about the Persian occupation of Egypt. Our only significant historical source lies with the fragments of some surviving Egyptian documents, which show the Egyptian authorities dated these documents from the time of the Persian occupation of Alexandria, i.e. June 619. This suggests little resistance to the Persians, unlike the desperate struggle the native Roman populations in the Balkans put up against the Slavs and Avars. So why was a province like Egypt, so resolutely Christian and so long a part of the Roman Empire, so completely willing to surrender to the Persian invaders? This has always been a mystery, and we can only guess at the answer. But factors that might explain it include, first, the apparently benign Persian rule. The Persians don't seem to have mistreated the Egyptian population, and there's no mention, for example, of the sort of pillaging and looting that normally accompanied the Slav and Avar invasions of the Balkans. Second, antipathy towards the Persians may also have been tempered by animosity towards Constantinople. As I mentioned earlier, the religious and political divisions within the empire, especially those between Monophysite Egypt and Chalcedonian Constantinople, were, I suggest, much more damaging to the Roman Empire than many historians believe. For example, most Egyptians felt alienated by the imperial regime at Constantinople, which, for example, required them to make huge grain shipments to the capital. The money for the grain was paid to a small circle of the Egyptian upper classes, like the Appian family, who were closely involved with the court in Constantinople and often actually lived there. On top of that, there were strong racial and linguistic differences between the Egyptians and the Greek-speaking inhabitants of the northern Mediterranean. The Persians certainly weren't the Egyptians' favourite race, but they didn't regard them as their worst enemy as the Greeks did. The same apparent indifference to imperial rule would be repeated only 2 decades later with the Arab invasions, as we'll discuss in future episodes. After the fall of Alexandria, there was a lull in the fighting, which lasted until the beginning of 622. Both sides effectively paused for breath before continuing the conflict that would change the course of history. Unfortunately, for such an important conflict, we have very limited source material. We have no equivalent of the urbane history of Procopius, and we don't even have the more pedantic yet normally reliable narrative of Theophylact Simocatta, which is so essential to our understanding of the reign of Maurice. Instead, we're reliant on only one main source, the Expeditio Persica by George of Pisidia. We know little about him other than as his name implies. He came from Pisidia, a region of ancient Anatolia, approximately similar to the province of Antalya in modern Turkey. He was a minor cleric, a deacon in the great church of Hagia Sophia. What marked him out was his poetry, which was judged good enough by the patriarch Sergius and the emperor Heraclius himself for them to select him to write an epic poem, retelling the story of Heraclius's great victory over Persia, which has survived to this day. Not surprisingly, George's poetry, mainly in iambic verse and full of rhetorical flourishes, is more similar to that of a medieval troubadour recounting the story of King Arthur and his knights than the precise prose of Procopius and the classical Roman historians that we're used to. The purpose of George's poem was to eulogise Heraclius, and the historian's first task is to cross-reference it for accuracy with our otherwise meagre historical sources. What makes this especially challenging is not only our very limited information on Heraclius's reign, but also the extraordinary turnaround which occurred in it. For we have a marked divergence between the first and second halves. Right from his accession to the throne in 610, George describes Heraclius as an ideal ruler. Quote, his, i.e. Heraclius's, clear mind encompasses the whole earth like the ocean, watering everything yet never depleted. His clear mind is a fire of reasoned thoughts, which makes everything white and soothes everyone without burning them. End quote. But the historical reality in the first half of his reign didn't support such praise, for by 622 Heraclius had in fact completely failed in every respect. Under his rule, the Romans had lost every single battle of any significance they fought, and by far their worst defeat, which they suffered in 613 outside Antioch, was the one when Heraclius personally led the army into battle. More than half of the empire had been lost to the Persians, including its richest provinces in Syria, the Levant and Egypt, which probably accounted for over 2/3 of its total tax revenues. In short, Heraclius's reign had been catastrophic. But what makes it hard to discern this fact from fiction in George's poetry is that Heraclius genuinely went on to become one of the greatest of all Roman emperors, for his achievements in the second half of his reign, or at least up until the Arab invasions, were as astonishing as his earlier failures were disappointing. So what happened? Well, I think it was all about money. In the first half of his reign, one of the many problems Heraclius faced was a shortage of cash. He'd inherited Justinian's overstretched empire, made even more overstretched by the incompetence of Phocas's rule and the bitter civil war that followed. The Roman army was all over the place. A significant part of it was fighting a civil war in Egypt and Constantinople as Heraclius launched his attack on Phocas. After his victory over Phocas, Heraclius mobilized a field army to take on the Persians, but probably because of a lack of money and preparation, as already described, he was defeated outside Antioch in 613. I think the fall of Egypt in 619-20 was the turning point for the Romans. They realized the game was up unless they did something truly drastic. Heraclius knew he had to make the Roman army again into a first-class fighting machine, such as it had been under Belisarius. And to do that, he needed money. With the loss of Egypt and much of the Middle East, the Roman treasury had lost, probably as I mentioned, over 2/3 of its tax revenues, so the financial situation was now critical. But there was still one place that had a lot of gold, and that was the church. Heraclius got on well with the patriarch Sergius, who agreed in this moment of extreme crisis to loan Heraclius most of the church's golden plate, in the rather vain hope it would at some point be returned. For example, we know that all the candelabra in the many churches in Constantinople, which were often made of pure gold, were melted down so that Heraclius, in the words of the chronicler Theophanes, quote, coined large numbers of numismata, end quote, the numismata being the gold solidus so beloved of the Roman treasury. This was the vital step. For the first time, Heraclius had the money to recruit and equip an army. George of Pisidia has left us with copious descriptions of how Heraclius worked night and day in late 621 and early 622 to build a new army. Unfortunately, he doesn't give us details about the regiments and types of soldiers, but it wasn't an army spread out along long frontiers as it had been over the last 20 years. It was a single unit, a large field army that Heraclius built into a highly professional and hard-hitting force. It was a mix of the remains of the old army together with lots of new recruits. No doubt the old soldiers were given the task of training the new ones. George says Heraclius gathered the troops across the Bosphorus from Constantinople in a single place, the plain of Bithynia. He paints a picture of endless rows of tents, military standards lined up, and an intensive training program. Mock fights were staged between the different regiments. The soldiers were taught a wide range of manoeuvres, how to close ranks and form solid lines bristling with weapons, how to advance, turn, retreat. All the time, George claims it was Heraclius himself who was giving the orders, drilling his troops, making speeches to them morning and night, convincing them of the dire situation they faced and how they could overcome it. George marvelled at, quote, manoeuvres orchestrated by a single commanding intelligence, end quote. I'm reminded of Procopius's descriptions of how Belisarius would do exactly the same with his troops, training them and imbuing them with a sense of purpose and self-confidence. Procopius said Belisarius's skill lay not just encouraging his soldiers, but also reprimanding them when they failed to meet his high standards. He often got their attention by telling them they would be toast if they didn't up their game. I imagine Heraclius was exactly the same. Although we don't know for sure, I'm pretty certain the core of this army was the cavalry, just as it had been in Belisarius's era, and not just ordinary cavalry. It was the armoured horsemen who were also expert archers. This theory is supported by the extreme mobility of Heraclius's new army, which would make lightning raids into Persian territory, as we'll hear more about in future episodes. Another important feature of this new army was that it was led by the emperor himself. The first time in centuries that an emperor had taken such a close personal interest in the army. The troops had the reassurance that they were the emperor's top priority and that most of the time he was there with them. And Heraclius spent the next 6 years, from 622 to 628, almost entirely with his troops. He hardly ever went to the imperial palace. Instead, he lived with his men under canvas, eating the same food as them and constantly visible. It was this type of leadership which won the soldiers' loyalty and willingness to endure the hardships of war, and they would need all of that in the 6 years ahead. After several months of training in May or June 622, Heraclius was ready to advance and face the Persians. After the fall of Egypt, the two most senior Persian generals, Shahrbaraz and Shan, had moved to Anatolia, where they were making steady, if unspectacular, progress towards Constantinople. Unlike the supine Egyptian surrender to the Persians after the fall of Alexandria, in Anatolia every fortified town and city was desperately fighting to the last man. We have no idea how large Heraclius' army was. Most historians speculate it comprised somewhere between 15 to 20,000 men, so the equivalent of a couple of field armies. The most important thing was it was large enough to take the Persians on. We have no very reliable details of exactly what happened in 622, but in his epic poem, George of Pisidia describes a Roman victory over Sharbaraz. He says the emperor was everywhere, making ambushes, cavalry charges, using guerrilla tactics, whatever was needed to defeat the Persians. Heraclius was always in the front line, leading his men, quote, hair plastered in dust, protected from the sun by a coating of sweat, lance replacing sceptre, shield replacing crown, eager to dye the black boots of a soldier red with Persian blood. End quote. Whatever happened, the Persian advance was halted. The Romans may not have won a great victory, but it was a turning point. The Roman army had been reborn. A fighting force fiercely loyal to Heraclius had been established that would now develop into the best army in Western Eurasia. Heraclius' training had paid off. Heraclius had also added a new ingredient: religious fervour. Our main source, the poet George, is clear that for the first time in Roman history, Heraclius addressed his troops as Christians, fighting a holy war against unbelievers. Not just Rome was on the line, but Christendom as well. Although Heraclius never used the term crusader, centuries later the medieval Crusaders honoured him and his army with the title the First Crusaders. But no sooner had Heraclius stopped the Persian advance and was ready to move on to the attack than disquieting news reached him. A new Khagan of the Avars had advanced to Thessalonica, now the second city of the empire, and laid siege to it. And this was no casual raid across the Danube. An enormous Avar army, probably over 30,000 strong, replete with a formidable array of siege engines and artillery, for which the Avars were particularly famous, having long ago developed such techniques fighting the Chinese, and including one siege tower taller than the walls of Thessalonica, was now outside those city walls. If Thessalonica fell to the Avars, the whole of the Balkans and Greece would be open to Avar invasion. Heraclius postponed his planned offensive against the Persians and immediately started on his return to Constantinople. His mission now was to save the West. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next episode will be in a week's time on the 21st of December, and we'll continue with the incredibly exciting story of Heraclius and the last war of antiquity. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review and join my mailing list on my website, nickholmesauthor.com. Link in the show notes where you'll find maps, blogs, and a free ebook. And also do look up my latest book, Justinian's Empire, which is just out on Amazon. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.